Get the latest Impact Podcast right into your inbox each week. Subscribe by entering your email address at impactpodcast.com to make sure you never miss an interview. This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by ERI. ERI has a mission to protect people, the planet, and your privacy, and is the largest fully integrated IT and electronics asset disposition provider and cybersecurity-focused hardware destruction company in the United States, and maybe even the world. For more information on how ERI can help your business properly dispose of outdated electronic hardware devices, please visit eridirect.com. This episode of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by Closed Loop Partners. Closed Loop Partners is a leading circular economy investor in the United States with an extensive network of Fortune 500 corporate investors, family offices, institutional investors, industry experts, and impact partners. Closed Loop's platform spans the arc of capital from venture capital to private equity, bridging gaps and fostering synergies to scale the circular economy. To find Closed Loop Partners, please go to www.closedlooppartners.com. Welcome to another edition of the Impact Podcast. I'm John Shigarian, and I'm so lucky to have with us today Chris Lewis. He's the Global Infrastructure Leader of Government and Public Sector at EY. Welcome to the Impact Podcast, Chris.
John, thank you. It's fantastic to be here. And
it's so lovely to have you. And I thank you for hanging around in your wonderful library a little later today. I know you're taping this in your library a little bit outside of London, your library office. And I just love the background. I told you before we started taping, it's my favorite background I've ever seen in any of the interviews I've done. And I'm dreaming of one day having a library like that in my home. My wife and I have talked about it for many years now.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I have a lot of books, and I'm an avid reader, so it's where to store them all. But yeah, gosh. Thank you very much.
Talk a little bit about, before we get talking about all the important work you're doing in government and public sector at EY, and for our listeners and viewers, EY, of course, is Ernst & Young, EY, EY.com to find it. And any of the links we'll put in our show notes today, of course. Before we get talking about all this important work and very timely work that you're doing, share a little bit about the Chris Lewis story. Where'd you grow up and how'd you get on this fascinating and important journey?
Sure, yeah. So I'm English, so I was brought up just south of London, a place called Surrey, a little sort of village in the country. My father was actually an accountant, so I was, son of an accountant, and now work for a big accountancy. Although I'm not an accountant, so I went to school in Surrey, and then I went to university in Cambridge, and read economics. And after doing an economics degree, I then went straight into management consultancy. I really loved the idea of the variety you get from consultancy, and so I joined what is now Accenture, was Andersen Consulting then. And I did 8-9 years working in the oil and gas industry, which was fascinating on some really, international projects. And then I switched into EY in 2006. So, been quite a few years now at EY. And when I moved to EY, I focused in on the UK national infrastructure. So I did a number of years on some of the big national infrastructure projects that we've got here. So that meant some of the new nuclear projects, the transmission grid upgrades, the distribution projects, a lot of the energy system, as well as some rail and road projects. So, and then a couple of years ago, I took on the global infrastructure role. So now spend a lot of time talking to people all around the world about the transition. And pretty much then the focus really was around sustainability and net zero and what infrastructure we need for that. So that's been my journey to get here.
Now, do you have colleagues and counterparts at EY in all regions around the world that you get to work with, or is it outside of the EY group also that you talk to experts and leaders around the world, or is it a mixture of both?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, EY has sort of nearly 400,000 people globally. So it's a
Wow.
huge number of people around the world. About 25,000 of them work on infrastructure. So we
Oh,
have leaders in countries, all around the world who are focusing on, how do you set up, how do you finance infrastructure projects, and how do you get them enabled for delivery. So there's actually a huge network. And one of my jobs is just to connect those people as to everything that's going on,
right.
which is fascinating. And it's an amazing network.
I want to go into that connecting part a little bit, but let's talk a little bit about, let's set this up. So, in America, in the United States, we are very familiar with now the what Joe Biden and his administration put in the Investment Recovery Act. Talk a little bit about though the genesis of that. Was this as new as it felt in the United States, or is this something that you have been tracking around the world in numerous other countries, including the UK, for many years? And this was just the American version of something else that's been done somewhere, and our administration here trying to do it just better.
Yeah, I think this is a global trend. I mean, climate change has been with us for quite a while, and we've seen the rise in carbon emissions and the associated temperature rises. So I think now you're really seeing the climatic events. I mean, here we had our wettest February ever
Right,
in southern England. So, and I know many people have had their driest sort of
right.
February ever. If you're talking to colleagues down in Australia, so actually, it's been going for quite some time. This initiatives to try to decarbonize. I mean, I switched out of oil and gas and into the kind of decarbonization projects in 2006. We were involved in some of the early closure of coal-fired power stations in 2008, and so there were limited running regimes then. So there's been various regulations coming in to try to address it. But I think a combination of factors have happened. The continual rise in the total level of carbon emissions, um, you know, even after all the initiatives around, Paris and the COP, and we had the 28, COP in Dubai. So the continual rise of emissions, even after all of those
Yeah.
initiatives, and then we had COVID, and that there was quite a lot of focus about, well, what is the recovery and what does the new world look like? Actually, emissions did drop because people travelled less and people moved around less, so there was some reduction. So I think there was quite a lot of thinking around the globe around what does the future look like? This combination of we're turning back to normality and we need an economic recovery, but we can't do it in a way that further damage to the planet. So we did a report that showed between 2020 and 2050, we have to invest $139 trillion to hit net zero, to meet the goals that we've got to stop putting more carbon emissions into the world. And of that, 75 trillion is already committed in schemes around the world. So there's a huge number of different initiatives, and it could be the Inflation Reduction Act. There's an EU Green Deal. There's UK equivalents. There's basically initiatives from governments all around the world to try to meet their net zero commitments.
So walk me through this a little bit. Like, first of all, that report, can you send us a link so we can link to that back in our show notes for all our listeners and viewers?
Absolutely, yeah. We did it with FIDIC, so the International Consulting Engineering Organization, who were
Beautiful.
celebrating their 110th year. So it was
We'd
done in
love
combination
to.
with them.
I'd love to
Yeah.
give all our listeners and viewers a link to that in our show notes, because that's a very important report. But talk about, like, so how do you look at it on a macro basis? Do you have walk us through the behind the curtain at EY? Do you have sort of a dashboard that literally you can pull up on your screen at any time, and your colleagues at EY who work in infrastructure with you, and you can track all the different international programs that are working towards these goals 2050?
Yeah, we do actually. We have a database of big projects. What
Wow.
you pretty much see is most countries in the world try to set out then a net zero plan. How are we going to decarbonize our economy? And that then sets out a pathway with committed projects, sort of projects in the development phase, and idea type projects or necessary areas of need. And so you have this pipeline. So some of them publish them through governments, where you get a really clear, here's our decarbonisation plan, and some of them are sort of revealed through the projects that you can see. But yeah, we have a database of projects from all around the world, and they cover a huge variety of technologies. Be it uh, onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, hydrogen, carbon capture storage, new nuclear power, transport, diesel to electric trains, a huge variety of different initiatives to try to decarbonize.
So talk a little about, like, walk us behind the scenes, a day in the life of Chris Lewis. How do you, so this is a fascinating world you're living in, because it's literally arguably one of the most important issue of our times, because if we don't solve this, we don't have the luxury or the ability to go talk about a lot less important issues. If we don't have clean air to breathe and a decent weather pattern to live in without tragic hurricanes and all the massive vicissitudes of weather changes we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years, if we don't solve this by 2050, the rest of the problems become minuscule. So you're in the middle. You're in the eye of the solve of one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue of our lifetime. What's your day look like? Are you working with world leaders and members of every administration imaginable around the world, and then connecting them with solutions that they're looking for that they can announce? Or how do you go about your day?
Yeah, so we work with government, and we work with the major companies who are trying to develop the infrastructure of the future. And what does it look like? You start with, what is the need? Our role in EY is as a key advisor into the sector. So The first thing is, what's the case? What's the strategic need? What's the commercial need? And is there a kind of viable project out there? So that that might mean a very hard to abate sector that's creating loads of emissions. And the question is, how do we continue to create, steel or cars, or how do we continue to produce, or the energy sector? We've got in many parts of the world, still, as I said, coal plant still being built in the world, gas plants that still produce a lot of the energy. So it starts with that. What's the strategic need? And that can be, okay, we need a new nuclear power station. We need 50 gigawatts of offshore wind in this. So it starts with that. What's the case? And then you get through to then getting the kind of development budget, if you like. Okay, now we need to develop this project. And when you get into the next stage, you've got to look at, okay, we actually need to make the project a reality. So there's getting planning approval, getting the support, getting the sponsor funding for the development stage, making sure you've got the finance in place, making sure you understand who's going to deliver, so the procurement and organization of the delivery of the project, and then setting up a capable owner for the project. Each of these major infrastructure initiatives needs a really strong client organization who can own the delivery and operations. And then you move into the delivery stage, which is when you get to what we call final investment decision, when you get through FID, as it's known. And that's the point when you've got the finance in place, you've got the suppliers who are going to deliver, everyone's bought into the commercial value, strategic value, and then you get on with the delivery of the new asset.
Okay, so it's multi-phased and multi-phases you're working on, and EY has specialties that cover all those different phases. Let's go back to the beginning, though. You're contacted by the administration. Walk us through a couple common macro themes. I would assume, but I want you to disavow me of this if I'm wrong, that one of the common themes that you're approached with from different administrations and leadership groups across the world is the race to achieve net zero in any given country. Is that one of your top 3 or 2 macro themes that they're trying to achieve?
Yeah, that's right. When you set out on a journey with a country, you look at one, what is the environmental goal, and then also the prosperity goal. How is this economically viable? And then finally, also there's a society and equity. Where can we put it that makes it good for our broader society? But often where we start with governments is, how do I create a net zero plan? How do I move from a high emitting world into a low emitting world? And that starts often with, how do I transform my energy system? How can I stop my energy system? And then the simple steps: get coal out of the system. How do we transition away from gas? How do we put more renewables in the system? How do we create more baseload power? And I always talk about step 1 is kind of, get the generation energy system to net zero. And step 2 is sort of electrify everything. So when you've got then a net zero system, then people say, okay, we want to electrify our transport, our trains, our cars, we want to electrify some of the heavy industry. We want to work out how we electrify our heating systems. So yeah, it's often, how can we deliver net zero? How do we create a low carbon emission energy system, and then how do we start to electrify everything?
So on a macro basis, that's the beginnings of a great 3-step process right there in the beginnings of laying out a master plan with it. Now, does it ever happen behind closed doors where you come in as an advisor? They know you're one of the top experts in the world because you have, as you say, 25,000 of your 400,000 employees are working in infrastructure. So they know you have more experience than anybody else at this stuff. Do they go off on a tangent and you have to roll them back in a little bit? Say, guys, ladies and gentlemen, this is wonderful what you're talking about, but let me put you on the right path. Do you have to sometimes have gentle conversations like that with some of these world leaders and tell them which way to go here? Is this part of what you do?
It's not an easy task to decarbonize.
I'm not saying it's easy. I just want to know, is it part of your reality?
Yeah, and often people go down the wrong path or make mistakes, or they're just not aware. Actually, there's a really fantastic, I don't know if you're familiar with the Solar Impulse Foundation. So the guy that created the plane that did the circumnavigation with a solar plane, they created a foundation that looks at all the technologies in the world that are both good for the planet, sustainable, and are commercially viable in today's market. So I think that's the sweet spot. Is how do you find things that actually can be net zero without having to increase prices for everything? And in many cases, Europe, we've got wholesale prices of sort of 80, 100 pounds for a megawatt hour of power, and actually you can deliver onshore wind at 30 pounds, offshore at 50. Always available baseload at sort of 70. So it's how do you find the most commercially viable projects that are net zero, and how do you build them into your system, and how do you avoid going down some of the heavy subsidy routes? So that's the trick, I think.
I nominate you to fix our problems in California because we have energy problems in California. Our prices are sky high. We need Chris Lewis and your team to come over here and fix us over here. I'll tell you that. So, okay, so I understand the macro and I understand what you're doing, and you're truly one of you and your colleagues at EY are truly one of the great experts in the world. For our listeners and viewers who just joined us, we're so excited and honored to have with us today Chris Lewis. He's the global infrastructure leader at government and public sector work at EY. To find Chris and his 25,000 colleagues that are working in infrastructure, besides their 400,000 colleagues at EY, go to ey.com. ey.com, and also we're going to link to all of his reports that he's working on in our show notes and all the important things that we're talking about today. So you're advising these governments. You got them on a good path of macro understanding. Let's go to net zero. Let's electrify as much as we can, and let's do it in the most commercially viable way that makes sense, borrowing from some of your other learnings from around the world, because you're doing this so much around the world. You truly get to be the subject matter expert here. Now, what comes next? Bringing together all the right people, and you facilitating, being the great connector and facilitator of putting private with public to make these electrifications and make these goals achievable.
That's exactly right, John. Yeah, I mean, so firstly, you lay out a sort of pathway, and that has a set of projects within it, and then you get into that. Okay, who's going to pay for these projects? Where are we going to get the finance from it? And what you're seeing, around the world, the level of debt that each country has taken on after, the various different events that have happened over the past few years. Most countries now are faced with a position where they actually have very high public debt. And so the question is, are we going to pay for this on the public debt? Is it going to be a government-owned asset, or are we going to get the private sector to fund it? Or do we actually think we're going to defer and do this later? That's usually the choice for governments: to be, public debt, private sector enablement, or defer. And most of the countries are looking at how can we get greater private sector involvement. So how do we make these projects really appealing to the private sector? What is needed in order to get investors to come in? And that is done through a whole different set of mechanisms, but all of them essentially are trying to incentivize people to go and invest in new infrastructure that will deliver net zero.
Are you tasked with that, though? Are you the one tasked with coming up with those incentives?
Yeah, we will either work to help design and organize the incentive structure, or with the companies trying to work out how do they encourage and offer a structure that can work for them, but will allow them to finance it. And often it starts, if you have a really big infrastructure project, you actually need to have a credit rating for the project. You know, you need to be able to get money into it. So the challenge we often have for our clients is, how can we create a strong credit rating for this project? How do we create it so that it's got revenue stability, it's got certainty of delivery, it's got a strong operational support, and that is often the trick. You know, getting private finance in so that it doesn't all go on the public balance sheet, and that the private sector can get a return from it.
But then, how do you do that? Like, what, since you're truly going, you're on untrodden ground where steps haven't been taken before. It's fascinating what you're doing, Chris, but how do you go about doing that? How do you rate the risk of a project, rate the credit worthiness of a project, so you can attract more investors to privatize these projects and accelerate these projects happening, so we can accelerate our net zero opportunities around the world?
Yeah, so you've got to look at the the revenue system. So is it a user-based revenue system, which often they are? So things like contract for difference. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the contract for difference structure.
No, talk about it. Talk about it.
The contract for difference has been used for a lot of renewables. So, for example, big offshore wind industry running on contract for difference. There's actually been 7 rounds, I think, in the UK where I'm sat today. And what you get offered there, if you're going to go away and build an offshore wind turbine, you get offered a guaranteed price based on an auction. So I'll auction, and let's say I get given $50. Sorry about that. Let's say I get given. Start that again. If you run a contract for difference auction and you get given $50, say, to go away and develop, and that guarantees you an energy price of $50 a megawatt hour. So if the price is above it, then you actually only get $50, and then 20 goes back to the consumer. If the price is below it, then it gets topped up to $50. That certainty of price allows you to go away and build an asset that you can then spend a year and a half, 2 years building, and then will run for 10 years on that certainty of revenue. So that's a kind of user-based revenue support model that allows people to go away and invest in long-term assets. There's other mechanisms as well. There's tax-based systems. There's value capture systems that looks at using sort of improvement in the land values around it. But we often look at those kind of user-based models.
So, Chris, you're truly one of the subject matter experts on these topics in the world, and these very important topics, because really the balance of the future of our planet is in what the work that you're doing. And I'm not trying to overstate it, but I also don't want to understate it. What you're doing is so important. That's why I wanted to have you on the show. But when you go to bed at night and you're running the algorithms in your head about the work that you're working on, beginnings of work in certain countries, more advanced work in other countries that you've been working on for a longer time, where do you come out on? Where do you feel that the gaps are today that you wish could get filled faster, so we can make more progress towards the greater good now?
So we came up with 5 commitments out of this report that we did with FIDIC.
Okay.
Commitment 1 was around the sustainability rating standard. Actually, in the process of building new infrastructure, we are in itself creating a lot of carbon emissions. The concrete, the steel needed. So the first is, how do we actually rate these new buildings so that we can say this is a gold standard building. It's going to be built to absolutely the lowest carbon emissions. The second one is, the commitment to work with governments around the world to lay out this net zero plan. Some governments are very advanced and clear, some aren't, are sort of in the early stages. It's hard for policymakers to try and identify where are the best ideas. And then the third one was this global repository of best ideas, if you like. There are a huge number of projects, that vast number of technologies that are really effective. There are many that aren't commercially effective or haven't been proven to work very well, but there's a lot of great ideas out there from around the world, and innovations. So that's the third area. And then there's also, if you look at the carbon emissions, most of them come in the developed world, and in the developing economies are going to follow a development path that's probably going to lead to their emissions. So how can we help multinational development banks? How can we help the international organizations to get investment support into those new areas so that they follow a decarbonisation path rather than a emissions and then decarbonize route?
So
So
let's
those
work
are
it.
the kind of things we've been talking about.
Yeah, so let's work it backwards. So let's go back to what you just brought up. How do we get more developing countries to follow, to get private investors to get on a better path faster? What's the answer there? How do you attract that more, investors and entice them to get involved with nascent projects?
Yeah, so you've got to try and de-risk the projects, and if because what investors want is certainty. They want a stable environment with certainty, and so if you're coming in, we published this report called the Renewable Energy Country Attractiveness Index, and it says what are the most attractive countries to invest in, and you'll see there are many big, stable, strong economies at the top of that. If you're a country that is on a development path, you're going to face a lot more sort of risks, political risks, credit risks, environment risks, higher inflation. So you're going to need more support in order to create a low risk project environment. And I think that's where the role of the multinational development banks really plays in. That's where things like, the emergence of the Blue Dot Network and the OECD are trying to drive towards, all about helping to get more common standards and more understanding and sharing of what are the risks that you face to mitigate risks for new investors into those areas.
That's interesting. And that makes total sense, de-risking it. Go back now to the thing before that, the repository. That's such a fascinating, but it's like, that's why I asked you right up front, about your dashboard. It's like sort of a dashboard, what projects are winning, which are not. Let's focus on doing more of the winning projects around the world. How likely is that global repository likely to happen? And is that a problem of the winners trying to hoard their good ideas, or just lack of ability to put it together and to create an infrastructure to put together a global repository? What is the gating factor there, and how likely is that to happen? Because that sounds like a brilliant idea to me.
Yeah, I mean, there are some ideas, if you go to like the LED light bulb, clearly much more efficient than the old light bulb.
Yeah.
Massive adoption has actually made a really big impact in the amount of energy we use. So that is a very simple, idea that has gone massively around. And I think if you look at all the technologies you can deploy to reduce carbon emissions that could be more commercially effective, most people probably only know 5% of them. So I think there's a lack of knowledge and awareness, just sharing what are the great ideas. There are clearly commercial advantages that mean that companies are promoting them, but it's often a lack of understanding about what all the different options are and how you go about accessing them. So I think, on that point, sharing the information, getting that well known, getting the design communities, the policy setting, the people that are choosing the projects to understand all the different options available, what the costs are, what are the benefits, and what are the potential impacts of them. So that was the intent for the global repository. That was the commitment from the FIDIC group.
So you agree, you're right on the front end of this. You're leading the charge that if we put together that global repository, that would accelerate our net zero around the world markedly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it could be you're designing a new building, the best technologies to bring. It could be you're designing a new energy system, the best way to produce the energy, to transmit and distribute it. So it's just about understanding where are the best systems in the world, where are the best technologies coming in, and what do we need to deploy.
Chris, it's like having the best. It's like having the answers to the big examination that you have to take up front. It's like having the answers up front.
Yeah, exactly.
So is that going to happen though? Is EY gonna, because you have such great coverage around the world? Are governments or some form of a UN or World Bank going to say, we're going to hire EY? EY should put that together, because it makes sense that your group should be the group that puts together that, because you have more visibility than almost anybody else on all these multifaceted countries, international countries, and also projects that are going on.
I think we have really good insights into, it's often our job, as I said, the key advisor to set up the case and to do the commercials and the structure and the financials. You've also got the whole design and engineering community who've got all the engineering knowledge,
Right.
and then you've got the whole policy community. So I think it is a collaboration across all of them. Us with the engineers, with all the and with the development companies to try to bring the best project possible. But the way we focus it often is by focusing on the outcomes. It sounds simple, but what is the outcome we're trying to enable? And can we get really clear and define the project outcome? As you said earlier, the environmental outcome, the prosperity outcome, the social equality outcome, and then what is the outcome we're seeking? And then simulating the best ways. And actually, you've got technologies like can generative AI do more to actually design and take all the IP in organizations and actually apply it to the outcome problems. Brilliant. And say, there are 20 different ways in which you could do this.
Yeah, but that's a fascinating. You bring up a great point. I'm so glad you brought up those two letters, AI. How has that changed your practice at EY, and how is that going to continue to evolve your practice in global infrastructure work with government and public sectors?
Yeah, I think if you look at the infrastructure and construction industry as a whole, it actually hasn't been a great adopter of technology. It hasn't got much more productive. And there's been a big trend around building information management, which actually has quite a low adoption rate, even though it's a technology that's been around for a number of years. AI obviously has accelerated and got massive adoption in a very short period of time. And we're in the early days of this of this. So the potential impact is huge. We've been collecting ideas actually around how is AI influencing. We did a session, I mentioned the COP28 event, the climate focus, which asks the question, how can AI deliver sustainable infrastructure? And we've been building on that again with the community of engineers around the world to try to look at, okay, AI has huge potential. Where is its best potential to help? Is it in the design? Is it in the definition of the outcome? And it's actually in many different potential areas. So huge potential. I think we're just at the start, though, of how we can use that technology.
Chris, you've been doing so much for a long time now, and you sit in a very important leadership position at EY, and also in terms of the future of the planet. What are 2 or 3 of your favorite projects that you worked on that you like to highlight when you sit down with a new leadership group that's looking for inspiration, aspiration, and some real tangible work that's been done historically?
Yeah, so I think there's firstly, infrastructure, net zero infrastructure doesn't have to be huge and hard. It can be simple. There's in the UK, I think we talk about 58% of energy we produce is actually wasted. So if you take a building, you can make a building 80% more efficient in its energy usage by focusing on the insulation, the lighting, the heating. So there's quite a lot of micro changes that could be applied that we can all take ownership for, be it putting solar panels in, the conversion of into electric cars, or the way in which we use public transport. So there's small changes in the home, in the infrastructure that we have, that can make a big impact. And I think it's not something that is just governments and major companies. That's the first point. The second one is there are some, fabulous technologies that are delivering, onshore wind, solar, the renewable technologies, and also the always available kind of base load. I've done a lot of work with nuclear power, and I think the potential for nuclear power, it's had this thing where for years people have been we had a massive drive. It was almost 20% in the UK. It's been up at 70% in France. So there's some countries that have really gone heavily into it and have very low carbon emission energy systems. And then for a number of years, we haven't really developed it. And now there's going to be this new nuclear renaissance, especially in Europe at the moment, a lot of Eastern Europe, a lot of people looking at how do we move off gas. So the nuclear technologies I'm really excited about. And I think that both the large scale ones have got great economic returns. Think projects like Hinkley Point in the UK, Sizewell C, as well as the small modular reactors. So all the new emerging technologies coming in there, really exciting projects. Wow. So the kind of home and the building efficiency projects, the large scale, always available baseload, and this emergence also of renewable and other technologies. It's a really exciting area, and it's hard to keep up with. I mean, you were saying we know all about it. I think, I feel I only know a very small percentage of everything that's out there.
That's fascinating. Chris, talk a little bit about the future ahead. Are you hopeful that we're going to get there? Are you hopeful? I mean, you and I, when we see that Charlie Munger just passed away 34 days before his 100th birthday, God willing, with technology now and all that we know about science and the body, you and I are going to be around a lot more time, and we have families that are going to be around us. How hopeful are you? If you're doing some of the most important work on the planet right now with your colleagues at EY. How hopeful are you about the years ahead? Are we going to make the progress that we need to make?
I am very hopeful, but I also think we need to address the challenge. Emissions are still rising. And we've been years and years and years on this journey to say we're going to reduce global emissions, and yet we are still emitting more today than we emitted yesterday, and we will emit more tomorrow. So we need to not shy away from the fact that we're not making the progress we need to. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because the government commitments, phasing out the fossil fuel commitments that we saw, the commitments to net zero. I'm hopeful because of the level of technology and the innovation that we're seeing in the sector. And I'm hopeful because we see really commercially viable projects coming on board every day that are making a big difference. But there's challenges ahead, definitely. There's also the challenge of this development path, as we talked about earlier. We can't just focus on how have the developed world gone through this journey of heavy industry and emissions and then trying to decarbonize. We have to find a sustainable path for the developing world.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're lucky on this planet to have you, Chris. We're lucky to have your colleagues at EY doing this very, very important work in global infrastructure between the government and public sector. I'm so thankful for your time today. I would love you to keep coming back on the show to share your continued journey. As we know, there's not a finish line here. This is going to be a continued journey in the years and decades ahead. And I'd love to hear updates as you go along. I want to thank you again for your time, staying up a little later. I know you're in south of London and it's coming to the supper hour there. But thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your inspiration. Thank you for all the work you're doing. And thank you to you and all your colleagues at EY for making the world a better place.
Thank you, John. And it's been an absolute pleasure. I've really appreciated the time spent with you. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And I'd be delighted to come back again.
This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by Engage. Engage is a digital booking platform revolutionizing the talent booking industry. With thousands of athletes, celebrities, entrepreneurs, and business leaders, Engage is the go-to spot for booking talent, for speeches, custom experiences, live streams, and much more. For more information on Engage or to book talent today, visit letsengage.com. This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by ERI. ERI has a mission to protect people, the planet, and your privacy, and is the largest fully integrated IT and electronics asset disposition provider and cybersecurity-focused hardware destruction company in the United States and maybe even the world. For more information on how ERI can help your business properly dispose of outdated electronic hardware devices, please visit eridirect.com.